Well, it's my pleasure to be able to give the last talk of today. We've been literally all over the world learning about the very beginning of the age of dinosaurs, and so it's only appropriate that we bring it back to Utah and talk about all the amazing creatures that lived here in Utah during the Triassic. I want to emphasize in particular that the work I'm going to present is a really big collaboration and is co-led by Andrew Milner from the St. George Dinosaur Discovery Site. And we've been working in a number of places in southeastern Utah over the past few years to really try and understand what late Triassic Utah was like and what sort of animals lived there. And today I'd like to focus a bit on the work we've been doing in the northern part of Bears Ears National Monument. As many people have noted, the Triassic is, of course, very famous for being the time of the origin of dinosaurs, and this is a reconstruction of all the sorts of different critters you might see in the late Triassic of the western United States. But I think what's really amazing is among all these weird and wonderful creatures, only these two little carnivorous animals in the background, one of which is about to be no more, are dinosaurs. Everything else are other types of fish, amphibians, reptiles, but not dinosaurs. So a big question that a number of speakers have addressed this weekend is, how did we go from a situation like this to having dinosaurs dominate? And of course, we're also talking about a time when all of the continents were together as one supercontinent called Pangaea, and just remind ourselves that Utah was here at about between 10 and 15 degrees north latitude, so very close to the equator, and at a time with no polar ice caps. As Dr. Whiteside mentioned earlier today, this was also a time of very high carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. So this is a graph of carbon dioxide over the last 300 million years. And here we have this magenta line represents 400 parts per million today. And the gray zone is where we are going in the next century in terms of carbon dioxide concentrations. And the Triassic is a great study time to understand what might happen in a high carbon dioxide world, because it had concentrations anywhere from levels we might see in the next century to the highest levels we've ever observed on Earth. And so we have a range of values where we have this natural experiment, and we can ask, how did ecosystems respond to those high carbon dioxide levels? And so one of the reasons why the late Triassic record in Utah is so important is that it helps us answer this question here. We know that there was this big mass extinction event at the end of the Triassic that a lot of people have talked about, but one of the things I'm interested in is whether there was any sort of stress on these ecosystems prior to this mass extinction. We know that things were getting drier and hotter as Pangaea drifted northward in the last 10, 15 million years of the Triassic. And so was that having any impact on these animals living in this ecosystem? Or were they just going along pretty happily until the big mass extinction event and everything suddenly died out? And so we might look for, do the ecosystems right before the end Triassic mass extinction have fewer species than those before? What's the evidence for the climate, things like that. And so that's what we're really trying to address when we go out to southern Utah to find fossils. And here's the challenge in answering this question. When we look at between 220 and 210 million years ago, in North America, we have lots of different places where we can find fossil vertebrate animals like early dinosaurs and phytosaurs and things like that. But in the last 9 to 10 million years of the late Triassic, right before that big mass extinction event, we have way fewer places where people have found vertebrate fossils. And that means we can't really answer that question with so few fossils. So we need to get back out there and build up that data set to be able to figure out whether ecosystems were already on the decline or not. And for those of you who can see the map, you can see one bright spot is Utah, and so that's why one of the reasons why it's such a great place to go to help answer this question. And Andrew and I and the team have been working in the Chinle Formation, these deposits of rivers and streams that have been mentioned multiple times in southern Utah. This is a typical cliff in southern Utah, and so the Chinle Formation are these multicolored slope-forming rocks that are sandwiched between the early Triassic Moenkopi Formation and the Triassic-Jurassic Wingate Sandstone. This is the big cliff-forming sandstone that all the rock climbers like down in southern Utah. And so we've been working in this formation for quite a while and in Bears Ears area for the past 5 years or so. And we're finding all sorts of different types of fossils, not just vertebrate animals, but we're really interested in all the different parts of the ecosystem. So we have plants. Here's a large plant fossil of this enigmatic plant called San Miguelia. You can see the central stalk and then hopefully the radiating leaves there. This is a reconstruction of what it might have looked like. We find lots and lots of evidence of crayfish in the form of their burrows. So these sort of cylindrical vertical shafts that you see in the rock, those are all crayfish burrows where 210 million years ago, a little crayfish dug down into a riverbank, sandy riverbank. Sometimes we even get little vertebrate fossils that fall in there and get trapped and fossilized too. One of the most amazing parts of the fossil record here are the fossil fish, the ray-finned fish. So in most places in the Chinle Formation, you just get isolated bones or scales and you can't really tell what type of fish you're dealing with. But we have a couple of sites that produce complete articulated fish where all the bones and scales are still in life position. When we dig them up, you can sort of see a vague fish outline here. And this one, you can see it going into the rock. There's impression of the fins here and the body. But when they're prepared, they're absolutely beautiful. You can see all the bones, scales, whatnot. And on the right side is an example from a little bit east of Bears Ears National Monument, where it's literally just, fish laying on top of fish, a fish fry, as you might call it. All different species. There's even a freshwater coelacanth down at the bottom with these rayfish fishes piled on top. So this has given us a really big clue as to what sort of organisms were living in those rivers and streams 210 million years ago. This is an example of a fish that Andrew found just this year. At first, it might look like just a big black stain on the rock, but if we zoom in, we can see there's incredible detail with all the different bones of the skull and the orbit preserved, and then this is the body, and you can see all the little ridges on the scales, the dorsal fins, some of the pectoral fins, things like that. So we get a really good understanding of these animals. Something that's very common in places like Petrified Forest National Park is in Arizona are these large flat-headed amphibians called Phytosaurs. Their heads and jaws kind of look like toilet bowl seat covers, as was mentioned yesterday. But they're incredibly rare fossils where we're working. We have only found a few bones, and this is one of those. This is part of a jaw. So you're looking at the roof of the mouth, basically, and here's some tooth sockets along the left side. This is kind of interesting that because in many places, these are some of the more common fossils you find, but for us, they're one of the rarest vertebrate fossils that we find in the Chinle Formation in this area. Perhaps the most common fossils are those of Phytosaurs, these long-snouted reptiles that look similar to modern crocodiles and alligators, but are only very distantly related. These are the skull here and lower jaws of the first skull we found in the Bears Ears National Monument area. And all these tiny little holes you see on that, those would have all been filled by teeth in life. So not something that you'd want to run into swimming in a Triassic river. Here's a reconstruction of what they might have looked like. And this year was really particularly awesome in terms of finding great specimens of Phytosaurs. The skulls are the parts of the skeleton that tell us most about the animal and what type of species it is. And this is another skull that was found. Here it is on this big block of rock that's sort of tumbled down the hill. You're looking again at the roof of the mouth here with the tooth sockets. This is a drawing of what a complete Phytosaur skull looks like, and here you're looking at the underside of the skull. And we do have most of the other parts of the skull. We'd already collected it by the time I took this photo. So this will be another relatively complete skull. And one thing hopefully you can notice is that if we go back here, this has a relatively narrow straight snout, whereas this has a wider snout with a big bulge in it. So perhaps a different species. We're still preparing it and hope to find out soon. And then in August, we found this specimen, which doesn't look like much, but is actually the most complete skull we found out there. It's going to be absolutely beautiful. Just the bit of the back end of the skull is pointing out here, and then way in the corner going to the rock is the snout here. It's upside down again, so you're looking at the roof of the mouth. And we've just started preparation of this skull, but it was featured on a number of stories for Science Friday this fall. If you happen to see those, you can listen to them online. And Andrew just gave me a photo yesterday of the current status, the preparation of this, and we're starting to see it emerge. So if we look at our skull here, this is a top-down view. The eyes are where the eyes would be in the orbits right here, and here's where the nostrils are. So this part of the skull, and we have the whole skull, pretty much every piece of it, and it's absolutely gorgeous. There's also some cool geologic details. Here are actually some mud cracks, some Triassic mud cracks. So although this was buried in a river channel, at least some point while it was still exposed, the river dried out, and the sediment actually got dry and cracked, and then there was refilling of the river channel and buried the rest of the skull. We find, at first, we weren't finding very many pieces of these armored reptiles called Aedosaurs, but in the last year and a half, we started to find a lot more. And because they're covered in these bony armored plates, that's pretty much the most common thing that we find. So these strap-like rectangular plates that covered the body of these herbivorous reptiles, that's one of those plates in cross-section, and then this is a top-down view, and you can see those little circular pits that are the ornamentation of those plates. And the cool thing about the pitting is that it differs by species. So just by finding one of the armor plates, we can tell which species it came from. The perhaps apex predators of the late Triassic are these animals called Rauisuchians. You might have heard of Postosuchus, which was featured in the original Walking with Dinosaurs. These are early crocodile relatives, but they walked upright on 4 feet with very large heads, lots of teeth. And they're very rare, but we have one partial skull that was discovered a year ago. This is the upper jaw here with some impressions of teeth sticking down, and this is the big lower jaw, and you can hopefully see the teeth sticking out of it there. So we're starting to get a sense of what those big predators were besides the Phytosaurs. And the cool thing is, not only do we find body fossils, but we also find evidence of these animals' behavior in terms of footprints and trackways. And they range in size greatly, from tiny little footprints that are no bigger than my thumb and probably made by some of the animals that Dr. Pritchard just talked about, to really large footprints. Here's a lens cap for scale, and pretty much everything in between. So these are likely made by something like a Tanystrophiid that he was talking about. We have footprints made by Phytosaurs, footprints made by Aedosaurs. This one's particularly large compared to the other Aedosaur footprints that we have. And we even have evidence of unusual behaviors. So for those of you up close, you might see that there's some parallel scratch marks on this picture here. Those are actually swimming footprints made by one of these Tanystrophiid-like animals, where it was swimming in the water and just the tips of its toes touched the sediment and made parallel scrape marks. So we know that these animals were swimming around in these rivers a bit. And the only evidence of early dinosaurs that we have no bones, but we do have some footprints. And they're all small three-toed footprints. So these small carnivorous dinosaurs, similar to what we're finding in other places like Ghost Ranch. Here's a nice individual footprint here and some others on the block. And then here's a trackway going down from the top right to the bottom left. But they're all relatively small, less than 15 or 20 centimeters long at most. And these were all made by these small carnivorous dinosaurs, probably something like Coelophysis or Tawa. And in that overlying cliff of sandstone, that preserves somewhere the Triassic mass extinction. The problem is cliffs are not very good places to find fossils because they're not exposed like nice badlands or hills, right? You just have a vertical face. But thankfully, the Wingate sandstone splits into these big columns that fall over and then tumble over and then expose the bedding planes, and we can find footprints that tell us something about that transition. And this is a pretty impressive block. Actually, I don't think there's a person in here, but basically a person would be about this tall. So really gigantic block. And you might notice all these dark divots all along this surface. Turns out those are footprints. This is covered in over 100 footprints of early dinosaurs, and tell us, quite a bit about the behavior and at least broadly what groups of animals were living during this time. We also find smaller blocks that have some of the classic small meat-eating dinosaur footprints. So let's put this all together and try and figure out what does it tell us about the last 10 million years of the Triassic period in Utah. Well, one of the interesting things is when we look at where we find these flat-headed amphibians, they're only in the lower part of the Chinle Formation. We don't find them really in the upper part. We have phytosaurs going all the way through, and in fact, we have phytosaur footprints from the lower part of the Wingate Sandstone. We have aedosaurs going all the way through, including some aedosaur footprints from the lower part there. There's one species of aedosaur that we just found for the first time last year that might be restricted to the lower part of the Chinle Formation, but we need to do more work there. The footprints of small carnivorous dinosaurs range most of the way through and go well into the Jurassic period, but footprints made by large carnivorous dinosaurs like Dilophosaurus are only found in the upper part of the Wingate Sandstone, the part that we think is Jurassic. And that's also true of all the different herbivorous or plant-eating dinosaur groups that Dr. Whiteside talked about. We only find their footprints or body fossils in the Jurassic part of the sequence. So they weren't around here in Utah in the Triassic. And so I think this gives us at least starting to give us a clue about what's going on and whether or not there's any problems in this ecosystem, any stress before the end Triassic mass extinction. We know from the geology of the sites that there is increasing aridity. It's getting hotter and drier, and maybe that explains why we only find amphibian fossils in the lower part. As things get hot and drier and those rivers and streams get smaller, these aquatic amphibians are no longer able to hang out. So that seems to be consistent. But a lot of the species we're finding, like the phytosaurs and the aedosaurs, don't seem to change much through the entire section. This seems to be the same species at the top and near the bottom. And so that seems to suggest some sort of stability. If we count up all the different types of animals that we found, vertebrate animals, there seem to be fewer species than are found in older late Triassic rocks, like at Petrified Forest National Park or in Texas or eastern United States, but that could just be a factor of the fact that we're just starting to work in southern Utah and find these fossils. Maybe as we continue to work, we'll find more species and then that will equilibrate. So there's still a lot to do to answer the question that I posed, but we're starting to get hints about it. And although this reconstruction was done for New Mexico, I think it applies quite well to the last 10 million years of the Triassic in Utah as well. And we are starting to work not only to find more fossils, but also get more detailed information about the environment using the methods that Dr. Whiteside described, and hopefully in the future can come back to another Dinofest and tell you more about what we've discovered. But it is definitely the case that this is one of the best places that we can look at that last 10 million years of the Triassic, because we've got lots of rocks that are exposed. They have lots of fossils in them, both body fossils, bones and teeth, but also footprints, and a rich sort of archive of what the environment was like. And maybe we can finally figure out whether there's these ecosystems that got hit very hard by the end of the Triassic were already hurting, or whether they were doing just fine and got surprised by these gigantic eruptions. Thank you so much.